The street where it happened looked like the kind of street where nothing happened. Bay 29th Street in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, ran through a neighborhood of modest brick houses and chain link fences, the kind of block where neighbors knew each other's cars and their routines, where a woman hanging laundry in a backyard in the morning and a man walking toward his driveway were ordinary things that did not require explanation. On the morning of April 13th, 1991, a 1991 Lincoln Town car sat in the driveway of a house on that street. Behind it, inside the house, a woman named Susan and two young children were going about whatever passes for a normal morning in a household that was not, in any sense that mattered, a normal household. Then came the sound of 7 gunshots. What happened in that driveway was the end of a life that had been constructed entirely around the idea that proximity to power was the safest place a man could be. For more than a decade, the man who stepped out of that house and toward that car had organized his entire existence around one central commitment: the protection and service of John Gotti, the boss of the Gambino crime family and the most recognizable organized crime figure in the United States during the 1980s. He had driven Gotti to where he needed to go. He had stood behind Gotti at the places where Gotti needed to be seen. He had handled what Gotti needed handled and executed what Gotti needed executed. He had been the instrument through which the Gotti regime enforced its will on the streets of Brooklyn, and he had built his own considerable criminal operation in the shadow of that relationship. The man who ordered his killing had never forgotten the night in September of 1986 when someone tried to kill him first. The detectives who found his address wore badges issued by the city of New York, and the man who actually pulled the trigger arrived and left without leaving behind the kind of evidence that produces an arrest. Bartholomew Boriello, known to everyone in his world as Bobby, had spent his life making John Gotti difficult to reach. What he could not protect himself from was the consequence of being that close to him. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from today. This channel covers stories like this one because they deserve to be told in full, and we want to know who is out there listening. If you are new here and want more history delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Bensonhurst and the family that heard everything from inside the house. South Brooklyn in the years after the Second World War was not a place that explained itself to outsiders. It was a collection of neighborhoods that operated according to arrangements older than the streets themselves, a world of social clubs and corner conversations where the men who controlled the waterfront, the numbers operations, and the loan desks of every Italian enclave from Coney Island to Red Hook were known by name and reputation to every family on every block. This understanding was not hidden. It was ambient, built into the texture of daily life in the way that certain things are understood by people who live inside a particular culture and invisible to everyone who does not. 3 separate crime families had embedded themselves in the geography of South Brooklyn in ways that overlapped and occasionally competed. The Gambino family owned the construction trades and the waterfront labor arrangements. The Genovese family controlled significant portions of the labor unions that governed work in lower Manhattan and throughout Brooklyn. The Colombo family ran street-level rackets through a network of crews that had been operating in the neighborhood for decades. A child growing up in the shadow of all 3 was not choosing between legitimate and criminal worlds. He was learning which currents ran where, and where the current ran strongest. Bartholomew Boriello was born into that world on March 31st, 1944, the son of a working-class family in a neighborhood where the organized crime presence was not an intrusion into ordinary life, but a structural feature of it. The documentary record does not preserve specific details about his parents or the particular household he grew up in. What it preserves is the environment, a densely settled Italian-American enclave where the men who controlled things were known to the children who would eventually either serve them or become them. Bobby grew into a physical presence that made a particular kind of future seem almost inevitable. 6 feet 3 inches tall and built with the density that comes from years of physical confidence and a constitutional orientation toward confrontation, he was the sort of young man that organizations deploy before they bother to give him titles. The family connection that shaped the earliest chapter of his criminal career came through his brother Stevie, The specific birth order of the two brothers is inconsistently recorded across available sources, but the nature of Stevie's relationships is consistently documented. He was embedded as a close friend and associate in the inner circle of the Gallow crew, the most independent and volatile faction within the Colombo crime family. Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo, his brother Albert, and the enforcer Frank Iliano had built a crew within the Colombo organization that operated with a degree of autonomy that the Colombo hierarchy had not formally authorized and could not fully control. Stevie Boriello was close enough to this world that when its fortunes shifted, his own shifted with them. Bobby entered that world as an enforcer. The work suited his presence. In the culture of South Brooklyn street organizations in the 1960s, a man 6 feet 3 inches tall with a demonstrated willingness to use violence was not a man who needed to seek employment. He was employment. The Gallow crew had rackets to protect, debts to collect, and people who needed to understand that certain arrangements were not negotiable. Bobby provided the understanding. It was not complicated work. What made it valuable was that he executed it reliably and without the kind of amateur unpredictability that draws the wrong kind of attention. A child growing up in the shadow of all of this was not choosing between two worlds. He was learning which currents ran where and where the current ran deepest. By the time he was in his early 20s, Bobby Boreello had a reputation and a rap sheet, and in the world he inhabited, those two things functioned as the same credential. Between 1967 and 1972, he was arrested 6 times on charges that documented the range of what he was doing: weapons possession, assault, larceny, and gambling. The charges moved through the system in the way that charges often move for men who had organizational backing and useful connections. Most were dismissed or resolved without consequences that kept him off the street for any significant period. This was not unusual. The organizations that employed men like Bobby also maintained, through accumulated relationships with the institutions of criminal justice, certain protective mechanisms that could be deployed when necessary. His arrest during this period produced a record rather than a sentence, which was more or less the intended outcome. What was happening in the wider Gallow crew world during these same years was considerably more dramatic than the mechanics of his own legal record. The Gallow faction had been in a state of chronic, occasionally violent conflict with the Colombo leadership since the late 1950s. Joe Gallo himself had the quality that the mob's internal culture simultaneously admired and feared. He operated as though the rules that governed everyone else were suggestions rather than requirements. He took meetings, made moves, and associated with people outside the organization in ways that the Colombo hierarchy found threatening. His crew was loyal to him rather than to the institution above him, and the distinction mattered enormously in a world where institutional loyalty was the currency of survival. The confrontation that had been building finally concluded on a night in April of 1972. Crazy Joe Gallo was at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy on April 7th, celebrating his birthday among friends, when the men who had come to resolve the problem arrived and shot him. He died at the scene. He was 43 years old. His murder did not dissolve the organization he had built. It reorganized it. For Stevie Boriello, who had been woven into the fabric of Crazy Joe's world through years of close association, the loss of the man at the center required a reorientation that the available historical record credits him with navigating effectively. He worked to maintain the crew's grip on the South Brooklyn rackets through the transition, preserving what could be preserved and finding shelter for what remained. For Bobby, the murder was a conclusion to one chapter and an implicit opening to the next. The framework that had organized his working life was gone. What replaced it would be considerably larger. The Gambino family that Bobby Boreello eventually joined was the largest and most profitable organized crime organization in the United States, and it ran on structural principles that were considerably more elaborate than anything he had encountered in the Gallow world. Under Paul Castellano, who had taken over from Carlo Gambino in 1976, the family projected a model of criminal enterprise deliberately removed from the visible street activity that Castellano regarded as both tactically dangerous and aesthetically distasteful. Castellano ran the organization from a white mansion on the Staten Island hilltop that law enforcement had taken to calling the White House. He dressed and spoke like a businessman, maintained the insistence on formal hierarchy that he believed separated a sophisticated organization from a gang, and had constructed a theory of criminal enterprise that emphasized penetration of legitimate industry over direct street violence. The specific mechanics of how Bobby migrated from the Gallow orbit into the Gambino organization are not fully preserved in the public record. What survives is the result. By the early 1980s, the transition was complete, and the Gambino family had accepted Bobby Boreello as a man worth knowing. He built his position in this new context the way he had built every previous position, through demonstrated reliability in situations that required a specific kind of dependability. The loan sharking operations he established in South Brooklyn, the gambling structures he maintained, the extortion arrangements he enforced across the neighborhoods that fell within his reach, these were not different in kind from what he had done for the Gallow crew. They were different in scale and in the institutional weight that backed them. A man collecting on a debt for the Gambino family was collecting with the implied authority of an organization that controlled the most important industries in the largest city in the country. He did not arrive at the top of that hierarchy quickly. He earned his way toward it through a combination of financial productivity, demonstrated violence, and the cultivation of relationships with the men who mattered in the organization. The specific details of how he moved from the street level toward the boss's circle are not fully preserved. What the record does preserve is what he became after the movement was complete. John Gotti had been building toward the confrontation with Paul Castellano for years before anyone in the organization formally acknowledged that such a confrontation was coming. The grievances were concrete and had been accumulating since before Gotti's ascent to captain, a running dispute over the percentage he took from hijacking operations at John F. Kennedy International Airport, Castellano's formal prohibition on drug trafficking in a crew that Gotti's associates were known to be violating, and a personal dimension rooted in Gotti's relationship with Neil Della Croce, the underboss who had been the primary check on Castellano's authority and whose approaching death from cancer made the confrontation feel like a narrowing clock. Della Croce died on December 2nd, 1985. Within 2 weeks, the calculation that had been implicit in Gotti's relationship with Castellano became explicit and irrevocable. Working with Frank De Chico, who had maintained a foot in both factions and served as the operational coordinator, and with Sammy Gravano, whose own crew had concrete reasons to want Castellano removed, Gotti organized the hit. 4 men waited near the entrance to Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan, outfitted in matching trench coats and fur hats for visual coordination among themselves. On December 16, 1985, at approximately 5:30 in the evening, Paul Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bellotti arrived by car for a dinner meeting. The men who waited for them, among them Salvatore Scala, John Carneglia, Vincent Artuso, and Edward Lino, shot them at the entrance. Gotti and Gravano watched from a car across the street to confirm the result, then drove slowly past the bodies before making their way back to Brooklyn. Gambino informant Dominic Lofaro later identified Bobby Boreello as one of the shooters, reasoning that Bobby was among the organization's most accomplished hitters and among the men Gotti trusted most with assignments of maximum seriousness. Bobby was never charged in connection with the Castellano murder. His specific role in what happened outside Sparks that December evening belongs to the category of things that the historical record does not resolve with certainty, and this account treats it as attributed by informant testimony rather than established by legal proceedings. What the record does establish is his standing in the organization at the moment of transition, trusted, capable, and fully embedded in the circle around the man who had just become the most powerful organized crime boss in the country. Gotti was formally acclaimed as the new boss of the Gambino family at a meeting of 20 captains held on January 15th, 1986. The elevation of the boss was the elevation of every man attached to him. On Christmas Eve of 1988, in an apartment on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan, Bobby Boreello received what the organization he had been working for since the 1970s had never formally given him. The apartment belonged to the mother of Gambino Captain Joseph Butch Corral, and the family had chosen it for a ceremony conducted with the elaborate ritual secrecy that the occasion demanded, even though everyone present understood exactly why they were there and what was going to happen. The ceremony that made a man a full member of the organization followed a ritual maintained across generations and across the Atlantic. The men being inducted were assembled in a room, told, if asked, to say they did not know why they had come, and brought before the senior figures who would administer the oath. A finger was pricked, blood was drawn, a saint's card was placed in the inductee's hands, set alight, and allowed to burn while the oath was recited. The commitment to silence, to obedience, to the organization above all other obligations, and to death before betrayal. Sammy Gravano, then the Gambino family consigliere, administered the oath alongside Captain Pasquale Pazziconte. The ceremony was witnessed by Captain John Jackie Nose D'Amico and John Gotti, the boss's brother. The men inducted that evening alongside Bobby included John Gotti Jr., Dominic Skinny Dom Pizzonia, Craig De Palma, Nicholas La Sorsa, and Michael Mikey Scars de Leonardo. De Leonardo would later testify about the ceremony in detail, describing the apartment, the men assembled, and the sequence of events with the specificity of a man who had committed every detail to memory because the occasion had been the most significant of his criminal life. The decision to induct the boss's son in a ceremony that included Bobby was not accidental. Gotti had felt that inducting his own son in a separate or solo ceremony would look like the kind of naked nepotism that captains would resent. By including Bobby, a man of demonstrated standing and established credibility within the organization, Gotti gave the induction a cover of institutional normalcy. The arrangement suited both men. For Gotti Jr., it provided the ceremony without the appearance of pure favoritism. For Bobby, it was public confirmation of something that had been true for years. The bond between him and John Gotti Sr. had developed into something that moved beyond the professional and into the personal, in the way that long-term working relationships between men who trust each other in dangerous situations tend to develop. They spent weekends together on Long Island, gambling and attending performances by Jay Black, a singer who had been a childhood friend of Gotti's and who represented, in their social world, a connection to a life that existed outside the organization's internal gravity. They ate together, traveled in each other's company, and maintained the kind of mutual regard that is, in any context, a form of genuine friendship. For a man who had spent most of his adult life in the service of organizations without the formal standing to direct them, the ceremony on Mulberry Street was the documentation of something that had already existed, in fact. Gotti assigned Bobby to the crew he had built around his son Junior. It was the assignment of the most trusted and most capable man available to the position that required exactly those qualities. The work that Bobby Boreello did for the Gambino family occupied two registers simultaneously, and he moved between them with the ease of someone who had never understood them as separate things. There was the work of being close to John Gotti, which meant being present, being ready, and serving as the physical embodiment of the deterrent that kept anyone who wanted to approach the boss from doing anything impulsive. Gotti celebrated public visibility. His appearances at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, his photographs in the tabloids, his willingness to hold court in full view of federal surveillance cameras as though daring law enforcement to make a case, all of this required men who understood that the boss's celebrity carried a physical vulnerability attached to it, and who were prepared to absorb that vulnerability on his behalf. And then there was the work of running an operation. Bobby directed his rackets from two primary locations: the One Over Golf Club in Carroll Gardens, a social club run by Gambino soldier Joseph Joe Pitts Conigliaro, a paraplegic gangster involved in loan sharking and gambling in the neighborhood, and a social club on Sackett Street in Brooklyn, from which he directed the operations that had become his specific domain within the organization. His territorial reach extended from South Brooklyn through Staten Island and into Queens and Manhattan. His rackets were the standard architecture of organized crime in the city during the late 1980s, loan sharking enforced through a reputation that rarely required the enforcement to be exercised, gambling operations that collected from the people who lost and from the people who ran the games, construction industry extortion that worked because no one wanted to find out what happened when they declined to cooperate. Stephen Kaplan operated strip clubs up and down the East Coast and paid tribute to both Bobby and John Gotti Jr. in exchange for the organizational protection that allowed him to run those operations without interference from anyone who might otherwise have chosen to interfere. In 1987, one of Bobby's crew members, Anthony Shorty Mascuzio from Carroll Gardens, was killed inside one of Kaplan's nightclubs, shot by a low-level associate named David Fisher over a business dispute. Bobby handled the aftermath in the way that a man of his standing handled such things, which is to say that the handling was thorough and not gentle. When Gotti was indicted in December of 1990 and had his bail denied, he installed a 5-man ruling panel to run Gambino family business in his expected absence. His son Junior was placed on the panel. Bobby became the acting capo of the Junior Gotti crew, the most operationally significant street-level position the organization had available during the period of the boss's incarceration. At home, on Bay 29th Street in Bensonhurst, there was a house. In the house lived a woman named Susan and 2 young children. The house was on a quiet block. It was the address of a man whose working life was never quiet, and the people inside it were not insulated from the consequences of that. When Gotti decided that Louis de Bono needed to die, he gave the job to the man he trusted most with jobs of that kind. Louis de Bono was a Gambino family soldier who had secured one of the more lucrative contracts available to a man with construction industry connections in New York in the late 1980s, the installation of fireproofing foam on the steel infrastructure of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The contract was worth approximately $1.5 million. De Bono's company applied the material to the structural steel beneath the floors of both towers. The arrangement had made him a wealthy man, and his wealth had apparently convinced him that the normal obligations of his position in the organization were flexible in ways they were not. His offense against Gotti was the kind that the boss categorized in the most serious terms available: not murder, not cooperation with the government, not betrayal of the family's secrets, but simple failure to appear. De Bono had stopped coming to meetings. He had stopped paying appropriate tribute on the profits his World Trade Center contract was generating. He had made himself difficult to locate in ways that communicated, to a man with Gotti's particular reading of these situations, a contempt for the hierarchy that Gotti had constructed, and that Gotti regarded as the foundation of everything he had built. Frank Lucchese, the acting underboss, reportedly attempted to broker a resolution, arguing that the offense might be forgiven in exchange for a payment. Gotti rejected the arrangement so forcefully that he removed Lucchese from the underboss position for making it. The order went to Bobby. On October 4th, 1990, Louis de Bono was found shot 3 times in the head in the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center, lying across the front seat of his 1987 Cadillac. A parking attendant found him at approximately 3 in the afternoon. De Bono had been there for approximately 3 days before anyone noticed. When Gravano grew concerned that no news coverage of the murder was appearing in the papers or on television, he sent for Bobby to find out what had happened. Bobby confirmed that the job was done and explained why the discovery had taken so long. De Bono had been in the garage of his own workplace, parked in a spot that no one had reason to check. Gravano subsequently took over the fireproofing contract. In the same period, Bobby created a separate and more complicated problem through an incident unconnected to Gotti's orders. He attempted to kill a Genovese family associate named Preston Garitano on a Brooklyn street, firing at him in public and failing to kill him. The complication was that Garitano had relatives in the Genovese family, which meant that an unsuccessful murder attempt against him created an interfamily diplomatic incident requiring a formal sit-down to resolve. The resolution was an arrangement. The Gambino representatives agreed to release Garitano to the Genovese family on the condition that the Genovese would themselves kill him if he attempted any retaliation against Bobby. The underlying reasons for Bobby's original attempt on Gaetano are not fully established in the documentary record. Bobby Boreello had carried out a murder and survived a diplomatic incident in the same calendar year. He did not know what both of those things had set in motion. Anthony Casso had been waiting to settle certain accounts since the autumn of 1986, and he had a way of obtaining information that made waiting possible. Casso was the underboss of the Lucchese crime family, a position he had risen to through a combination of operational capability and a willingness to use violence that his own associates described in terms that placed him outside the normal range of mob ferocity. He had admitted involvement in between 15 and 36 murders across his career. He had organized bombings, ordered kidnappings, and maintained his grip on the internal dynamics of the Lucchese family through the application of lethal force against anyone he suspected of disloyalty or weakness. Within the organizational culture of the New York mob, which was not lacking in men comfortable with extreme violence, Casso occupied a category of his own. The Castellano murder on December 16, 1985, produced a specific reaction in him that was both philosophical and personal. Philosophically, he regarded Gotti's unsanctioned removal of a sitting boss as precisely the kind of institutional vandalism that would bring the entire structure of New York organized crime down around everyone who lived inside it. The rules existed for reasons, and the most important reason was that without them, what had taken generations to build could be destroyed in an evening by any ambitious captain with the right connections and insufficient patience. Personally, he had been part of the effort coordinated between the Lucchese family and the Genovese family under Vincent Gigante to kill Gotti and the other Castellano conspirators as punishment for what they had done. The April 13th, 1986 car bomb that killed Frank DeCicco outside a social club in Bensonhurst was the product of that effort. The bomb had been intended to kill DeCicco and Gotti together. Gotti canceled his attendance at the last minute. DeCicco died in his car while a passenger mistaken for the boss survived with severe injuries. Then, on September 6th, 1986, the situation reversed itself. Casso was sitting outside a restaurant in Brooklyn when he was shot by men he identified as Gambino associates. He survived. He believed Bobby Boreello was among those who had been involved in the attempt. Whether Casso's belief was accurate is not established with certainty in the historical record. What is established is that he acted on that belief with the systematic thoroughness he applied to every project he undertook, and that he had an instrument available for the project that no other Lucchese underboss in the history of the organization had ever possessed. The two detectives who became known after their eventual arrest as the mob cops had been available to Casso since approximately 1986 or 1987, recruited through a career criminal and Lucchese associate named Burton Kaplan. Louis Eppolito was born in Brooklyn on July 22, 1948, the son of a family with its own Gambino connections. His uncle and his cousin were both made members of the Gambino family. Stephen Caracappa was born on November 12, 1942. Both men had been accepted into the New York City Police Department despite those connections, a function of incomplete background investigations and, in Eppolito's case, a false statement on his application regarding his relatives in organized crime. By the mid-1980s, both detectives were serving in the Organized Crime Homicide Unit within the NYPD's Major Case Squad. Caracappa's position in particular gave him access to the most sensitive law enforcement information available about the organized crime investigations the department was running, the names of cooperating witnesses, the details of pending indictments, the identities of targets under surveillance, the progress of specific investigations. For an underboss trying to stay one step ahead of a federal apparatus that was closing in on every New York crime family simultaneously, this access was more valuable than anything a street-level informant could have provided. The arrangement was $4,000 per month, delivered through Kaplan, for whatever information Casso needed. Additional per murder payments brought the total estimated across the length of their relationship to approximately $375,000. The murders and assists they carried out for Casso before the Boriello case established their track record. Israel Greenwald, a diamond dealer who threatened to expose an unrelated fraud of Kaplan's, was stopped in a phony traffic stop in February of 1986, taken to a garage, shot, and buried under a concrete floor. In December of 1986, the two detectives provided Casso with information about a Gambino associate named Nicholas Guido, whom Casso wanted dead for his suspected role in the September shooting. The information was wrong. The Nicholas Guido who was shot on Christmas Day at his home was a different man with the same name, an innocent person 3 years younger than the intended target. He died in front of his family. James Heidel, a Gambino associate genuinely suspected of involvement in the September shooting, was kidnapped by the detectives, placed in the trunk of a car, and delivered to Casso in October of 1986, who tortured and killed him. Bruno Facciolo, a Lucchese member whom Casso suspected of informing, was murdered with a canary stuffed in his mouth as a deliberate message to anyone else considering cooperation with the law enforcement. Casso called these two detectives his crystal ball. What that phrase meant in practice was this: he knew things he should not have been able to know, and he used that knowledge to eliminate people before they eliminated him. At some point before the spring of 1991, Anthony Casso contracted the two detectives not merely to provide information about Bobby Boreello, but to kill him. The contract was direct: find Bobby and eliminate him. Eppolito and Caracappa began conducting surveillance on the Bay 29th Street neighborhood in Bensonhurst. They were not ordinary surveillance operators. They were NYPD detectives, capable of moving through any neighborhood in the city without the kind of scrutiny that would attach to a civilian or to a known organized crime figure. They understood how surveillance was conducted because they had spent careers conducting it. The effort was supposed to establish Bobby's location and routine well enough to execute the job. Instead, one of the two detectives was spotted and recognized by a fellow police officer while searching the neighborhood for the target. The attempt was abandoned. What they gave Casso instead was assembled through a different method, and it was more damaging in some respects than the killing they had failed to carry out. They provided him with Bobby Boreello's home address on Bay 29th Street in Bensonhurst, and they provided him with an audio cassette. The cassette had been recorded without Bobby's knowledge. The DOJ indictment charging Eppolito and Caracappa describes the recording explicitly. On it, Bobby Boreello was heard repeatedly threatening Anthony Casso and his family. The existence of that cassette establishes that the corrupt detectives had conducted active audio surveillance of the man they had contracted to kill, capturing his voice, his words, and his specific and documented hostility toward the underboss who had placed the contract on him. What Bobby said on that recording, the exact words, and the precise context, is not described in granular detail in the available documentation. What the documentation establishes is that Casso listened to it, and that what he heard confirmed every belief he had already formed about Bobby Boreello's disposition toward him. Gotti's arrest in December of 1990 had shifted the organizational landscape in ways that mattered for Bobby's exposure. The ruling panel installed to manage family business in the boss's absence was a committee, not a single patron whose daily presence generated the protective gravity that Gotti himself had created around the men closest to him. Bobby was still capable, still connected, still running operations across multiple boroughs, but the specific deterrent effect of being John Gotti's most trusted and most visible street-level associate operated at a greater distance than it had when Gotti was present. In the late winter of 1991, Casso's network conducted further reconnaissance on Bobby's neighborhood to confirm he was still living at the Bay 29th Street address. Frank Lastarino, a Lucchese family captain known in the organization as Big Frank, was given the assignment of carrying out what the intelligence had made possible. By the first weeks of spring, everything that Lastarino needed was in place. April 13th, 1991 was a Saturday on a quiet street in Bensonhurst, and it was a date with a specific and significant history in the world of John Gotti's enemies. Exactly 5 years earlier, on April 13th, 1986, the car bomb that killed Frank DeSico had detonated outside a social club a few miles from this same block. Both that bombing and what was about to happen on Bay 29th Street were connected to the same thread running through the previous several years. The Lucchese family's sustained effort to make the people around Gotti pay for what had been done to Paul Castellano without the sanction of anyone who had the authority to sanction it. The street was quiet in the way that residential streets in Brooklyn are quiet on Saturday mornings. The Lincoln Town car was in the driveway. Inside the house, Susan Boriello and the two children were present. The historical record does not preserve what they were doing at that exact moment, and it is not the kind of detail that the people who lived through what followed would be likely to want placed in a document. Bobby stepped outside. Frank Lastarino fired 7 shots. 2 struck Bobby Boreello in the head. 5 struck him in the torso. He died in the street beside the car. A relative who arrived at the house later that morning found him there. The news reached the Gambino organization, and the question that followed was immediate. Who had done this, and why? Initial suspicion fell on Preston Garetano, the Genovese associate whom Bobby had tried to kill the previous year, and who had an obvious motive for retaliation. Law enforcement sources quoted in contemporary news coverage described early investigative theories that treated the killing as a personal vendetta connected to that incident, rather than as an organized inter-family operation. The Lucchese family's involvement was not immediately identified. The real architecture of what had just happened on Bay 29th Street was invisible to almost everyone who was trying to understand it. John Gotti, in federal custody and denied bail since the previous December, learned what had happened to the man who had been his driver, his protector, and one of the people he most genuinely trusted in the world. Susan Boriello and her children had been inside the house. They had not been protected from the sound of what happened in the driveway, and they were not protected from what came after. The Gambino family's response to what happened on April 13th began in 2 directions simultaneously, and both of them were wrong about something. From federal custody, Gotti directed Gambino family representatives to investigate the killing and respond. Sammy Gravano, still the underboss, and not yet cooperating with the government, attended a formal sit-down with Liborio Bartholomew, who was serving as the acting boss of the Genovese family. The purpose of the meeting was to demand an accounting for Preston Garetano and to seek Genovese's agreement to his execution. The Gambino position was that Garetano had retaliated against one of their men and that the Genovese were therefore responsible for delivering a consequence. The diplomatic channel was opened. The conversations were conducted in the careful, conditional language that interfamily negotiations required. Gotti also sent word to Stevie Boriello that he had permission to pursue revenge against whoever he needed to pursue it against, with the full backing of the organization behind him. The authorization carried the kind of weight that only came from the boss directly, and it represented both the highest expression of regard that the organization could offer the family of a murdered man and an entirely practical delegation of a problem that Gotti could not address from inside a federal detention facility. The Gambino family never significantly retaliated. The organizational pressures closing in from every direction in the early 1990s made sustained interfamily warfare a project that no one who understood the situation could prosecute with confidence. Gravano's decision to cooperate with the government in November of 1991 removed the most capable operational figure from the hierarchy. Gotti's conviction on multiple racketeering charges in April of 1992 and his sentence to life in federal prison that June formally ended whatever coordinated organizational response the family still possessed. The question of accountability for Bobby Boreello's murder drifted into the category of things the organization discussed without acting on. Preston Garetano, the man the Gambinos had blamed for the killing and had sought to have executed, lived for another 13 years after the morning on Bay 29th Street. He died in 2004, stabbed outside a restaurant in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, by his own brother-in-law, Andrew Gargiulo. Earlier that same day, Gaetano had apparently broken Gargiulo's arm with a baseball bat. The killing had nothing to do with the Boriello matter. The logic that had attached Gaetano's name to the events of April 13th, 1991 was built on the wrong foundation from the beginning, and the man it attached to died for entirely different and entirely personal reasons more than a decade after the fact. The Boriello family pursued the accounting available to them through the civil courts rather than through organizational channels that were no longer operating. The basis for the civil case was the documented connection between the New York City Police Department and the Lucchese family. Two serving detectives had been on the payroll of a Mafia underboss, and in that capacity had provided the intelligence that made Bobby's murder possible. The city of New York, confronted with that documentation, settled the civil suit for over $1,500,000. The settlement was an acknowledgment, rendered in the only language that institutions speak, that what the detectives had done was not solely their own responsibility. The city that employed them bore a share of what had been done to the man in the driveway and the family inside the house. In a detail that illustrated the specific gravitational pull of the Gambino world on the Boriello family even after Bobby's death, his in-laws later used their Brooklyn home as collateral to help secure a bond for John Gotti Jr. while he awaited trial on racketeering charges of his own. The financial arrangement was a continuation of the same loyalty that had defined Bobby's working life, extended now through his family's property rather than his own body. The full criminal accountability for what had been done to Bobby Boreello came through a different investigation and a different set of defendants. Burton Kaplan, who had served for years as the essential bridge between Anthony Casso and the two corrupt detectives, eventually made the decision to cooperate with the federal prosecutors. The investigation had circled the story of the mob cops for a decade, touching it at points that remained incomplete until Kaplan's testimony provided the connective tissue that physical evidence alone could not supply. In March of 2005, federal agents from the DEA and FBI arrested Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa at Piero's, an Italian restaurant near the Las Vegas Strip. Both men had relocated to Nevada after retiring from the police department. Eppolito had retired in 1990. Caracappa had left on a disability pension in 1992. They had been living in Las Vegas for over a decade when the agents walked in. The trial in 2006 was built on Kaplan's testimony and on the extensive documentation that federal investigators had assembled across years of work. The charges covered 8 murders in which the two detectives had participated directly or had enabled through the intelligence they provided. The Bobby Boreello case was among the 8. The conviction and all substantive charges came in 2006. The sentences came in 2009. Life in federal prison for both men, without the possibility of parole. Stephen Caracappa died in federal custody on April 8, 2017. Louis Eppolito died in federal custody on November 3, 2019. The 2 men who helped set the killing in motion died behind bars. The family inside the house on Bay 29th Street had been waiting longer than that for something that resembled an accounting. What Bobby Boreello's story reveals about the particular period it belongs to is not simply the story of a man who chose a dangerous world and paid the price that world charges for membership. That price is always implied in the choice, and the men who make it understand the arithmetic better than anyone. What the story reveals is something more specific: what it cost, in the Gambino family of the 1980s and the early 1990s, to be close to John Gotti. Gotti had made a deliberate and sustained decision about how to inhabit his position at the top of the most powerful organized crime organization in the country. He chose visibility when invisibility was not merely available but was, by every example available to him, the model of how a boss survived. He walked into the frame of federal surveillance cameras and gave them the photograph they needed. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club in full view of the FBI photographers who had set up on rooftops across the street and who documented his arrivals and departures with the persistence of men who understood that the record they were building would eventually matter. He dressed in ways that made him impossible to miss and conducted himself in public in ways that made his presence in any room the central fact of that room. The logic of this approach was not entirely without merit in the short term. His celebrity made him genuinely difficult to convict because jurors who recognized his face and associated it with a particular cultural mythology could be influenced in ways that evidence alone could not always overcome. 3 federal prosecutions failed before the 4th succeeded, and those earlier failures were not accidental. The Teflon Don's reputation for surviving indictments was built on real acquittals, but the visibility had a cost that accumulated in the men around him, and that Gotti, by temperament and by design, did not fully absorb himself. To be in Gotti's orbit was to be photographed in the same frames he occupied. To serve as his driver and bodyguard was to have the same lens that followed him follow you at the same moment, and to have every enemy who wanted to hurt Gotti and found that Gotti's direct protection was too formidable to breach understand that the men around him were the reachable alternative. Vincent Gigante, running his Genovese family from the streets of Greenwich Village in a torn bathrobe and shuffling slippers, building a deliberate and sustained fiction of mental incapacity that kept federal prosecutors out of his courtroom for decades, outlived Gotti by 3 years. He died in federal custody in December of 2005 at 77 years old, having spent the preceding decades constructing a system specifically designed to make him the last man anyone would think to look for. The philosophy he applied was the opposite of everything Gotti practiced, and the results were the opposite as well. Gigante's organization survived him. The men around Gigante were not the first targets of every enemy who wanted to reach him, because finding Gigante himself was the stated organizational priority of law enforcement and rival families alike, and he had made that priority nearly impossible to satisfy for the better part of 3 decades. Bobby Boreello served a man who wanted to be seen. That service required Bobby to be seen alongside him. The men who wanted to reach Gotti and found that they could not do so directly arrived eventually at the address of his most visible and most trusted associate instead. Bobby Boreello was 47 years old on April the 13th, 1991. He had built a life that made structural sense inside the world it inhabited. He had the rackets, the standing, the formal membership, the relationship with the boss, and the protection that was supposed to come with all of those things. He had a house in Bensonhurst and a family inside it. He had a car in the driveway. The corrupt detectives who made his murder possible wore the uniform of the institution that was supposed to protect the street his house sat on. The underboss who ordered the killing had been working toward it since 1986, patiently and with the resources of a family behind him. The captain who carried it out arrived and left without leaving the kind of evidence that produces charges, and inside the house, the people who heard what happened in the driveway had no preparation for the sound and no protection from what it meant. The street where it happened was quiet the next morning. It has been quiet ever since. Inside the house, the people who were there that day know what it sounded like.